The photograph was filed in the wrong archive for 82 years, preserved by accident rather than intention, surviving through bureaucratic oversight rather than deliberate curation. I discovered it not through military historical channels or official government repositories, but through the personal collection of a jeweler's widow in Vermont. She had contacted me after hearing about my work documenting forgotten contributions to World War II. After learning that I'd uncovered stories of hidden innovations, erased brilliance, and brilliant minds rendered invisible by systems determined to keep certain truths concealed. She'd been sorting through her late husband's belongings in the months following his death. He'd been a jeweler and optician by profession, she explained, and also a military consultant during the war years. She'd found a cardboard box filled with photographs, mostly technical documentation of optical equipment and lens assemblies, but one stood out among them, a formal military portrait dated August 1942, showing a middle-aged man in army uniform standing at a delicate workbench, surrounded by precision optical instruments and glass components. On the back of the photograph, in handwriting that seemed to belong to someone other than the jeweler himself, someone had written in careful script, "Marcus Whitfield, the man who gave snipers eyes. Never let anyone know how he did it. Destroy this if found." The widow, Margaret Whitfield, now 89 years old and remarkably sharp-minded despite her age, invited me to her home in a converted farmhouse outside Montpellier. The house was a museum of optical history, filled with her husband's equipment accumulated over a lifetime of work with glass and light. I saw microscopes from the 1920s, lens grinders from various eras, testing apparatus of extraordinary precision, the accumulated tools of someone who had dedicated his life to understanding how light behaved and how glass could be shaped to manipulate that behavior. Margaret showed me his personal journals, notebooks filled with optical calculations rendered in meticulous handwriting, sketches of lens designs, detailed experiments with glass compounds and refractive indices, records of a man thinking deeply about the properties of materials and their interactions with light. He never talked about it, Margaret told me, her hands trembling slightly as she held her husband's journals, the weight of preserved secrets evident in her gesture. Marcus was a quiet man, kind, brilliant, but quiet. He was born at the turn of the century, learned his craft from his father and mother, worked at his jeweler's shop in the 1930s, crafting delicate optical instruments, cutting gemstones with precision, designing fine jewelry for wealthy clients. Then the war came and the army contacted him. They wanted him to work on something classified, something important to the war effort. He was gone for 4 years, working in a classified facility somewhere in upstate New York. He never spoke about what he'd done there. When he came back, he returned to his jewelry business. He raised our family. He lived what appeared to be a normal, quiet life. But sometimes, late at night, I'd find him sitting alone in his workshop just staring at his lens-grinding equipment, looking profoundly sad, as if the weight of something was pressing down on him. "Did he ever tell you what the project was?" I asked, settling into a chair in her living room, understanding that I was about to hear something that had been kept secret for nearly half a century. "Not directly," Margaret said carefully, "but I found letters. Letters he wrote to me during the war but never sent. He kept them hidden in a box in the workshop, and after he died I found them while I was sorting his belongings. In them, he explained what he'd been working on. He explained the optical principle behind it, and he explained why he thought it should never be replicated, why the knowledge should die with him, why some technologies were too dangerous to allow to propagate into the future." She produced a bundle of letters, carefully preserved in acid-free folders written in Marcus Whitfield's meticulous hand. The letters were highly technical, filled with optical calculations and explanations of lens properties and glass chemistry, but they also told a story that seemed almost impossible on first reading. A jeweler and optical craftsman who had invented an optical system that allowed military snipers to see through fog, to maintain shooting accuracy in weather conditions that had previously rendered long-distance precision shooting impossible, to engage targets in conditions where visibility had been fundamentally compromised by atmospheric moisture and particulate matter. "This is what we wanted you to see," Margaret said, her voice carrying the weight of responsibility for preserving something her husband had tried to bury. "This is what Marcus wanted preserved even though he never wanted the technology to be used again. He said that what he'd created was powerful, but that power without wisdom was dangerous. He said that he'd been young and ambitious when he invented it, that he'd been proud of his innovation, but that by the end of the war, he'd come to understand the human cost of what his invention had enabled. He said he'd understood that some knowledge shouldn't be transmitted further, that some innovations needed to be limited, that moral responsibility sometimes meant deliberately restricting what you'd learned. I began the process of investigating Marcus Whitfield's story, understanding that I was entering territory that was both technically fascinating and morally complex, territory that raised profound questions about the relationship between innovation and responsibility, between technical achievement and ethical restraint. Here was someone who had created an innovation that had saved lives, American lives, Allied lives, but who had also understood, through the course of the war and its aftermath, that this same innovation had enabled death, had made killing easier and more precise, had changed the nature of warfare in ways that he'd come to regret profoundly. The photograph itself became my entry point into the investigation. The formal military portrait showed a man who appeared calm, focused, almost serene despite the technical complexity and military significance of the equipment surrounding him. His hands were steady, his expression concentrated, his eyes reflecting someone engaged in work that he took seriously. He looked like someone who understood that what he was working on mattered, who took pride in precision and craftsmanship, who believed he was serving his country through the application of optical engineering and optical science to military purposes and military defense. On the back of the photograph, beneath the cryptic notation about giving snipers eyes, someone had added an additional date in handwriting different from the original notation: August 1942. Before the consequences became clear, before we understood what we'd enabled, before Marcus understood what he'd done. The strange detail wasn't the optical system itself. It was the profound moral calculus that had driven Marcus Whitfield to invent it, and then the lifetime of regret that had driven him to spend the rest of his existence making sure that nobody could replicate what he'd created. I obtained the declassified military documentation related to the project through official FOIA requests and personal contacts within military archives. The files were remarkably sparse. Classified materials have a way of remaining classified even after official secrecy periods have expired, even after decades have passed, even when the information no longer poses any genuine security threat. But what remained in the declassified portions told a significant story. Marcus Whitfield had been recruited into a military research program dedicated to improving sniper accuracy at extreme distances and in adverse weather conditions. The existing optical systems of the time had fundamental limitations. In fog, rain, or mist, visibility was severely reduced. Snipers were effective only in clear conditions with good visibility. The Army wanted to fundamentally change that capability. Marcus's innovation was elegant and deceptively simple in concept, though extraordinarily complex in execution. A specialized lens compound that could selectively filter certain wavelengths of light while enhancing others, essentially allowing the human eye, assisted by the optical system, to see through moisture and particulate matter that would normally obscure vision completely. The lens system worked by manipulating light refraction in ways that had never been attempted before in any practical application. It required glass of unprecedented purity and uniformity, crafted by someone who understood optical principles at a level that theoretical physicists and military engineers had not yet achieved. Marcus had developed the lens compound through years of experimentation in his jewelry shop, studying how different glass compositions affected light refraction. He'd tested different chemical additives and material compounds systematically. He'd come to understand how minute variations in glass structure affected how light moved through the material. He'd translated that knowledge into a military application, creating a lens system that could be mounted on rifle scopes, giving snipers the ability to see and engage targets at extreme distances in conditions where visibility had previously been impossible. The military applications were immediate and extraordinarily significant. Snipers equipped with the Whitfield lens system could engage targets at distances up to 2,000 yards in conditions where conventional optics had a maximum effective range of perhaps 600 yards. The accuracy advantage was revolutionary, transforming sniping from a practice dependent on clear weather and good visibility into something that could function in almost any atmospheric condition. Snipers equipped with the system became more effective than they'd ever been, capable of precision shooting in weather conditions that had previously provided cover for enemy forces. But here's where the strange detail emerged. In the letters Marcus had written but never sent, he documented his growing moral distress about what his invention had enabled. As the war progressed, as he received reports about the effectiveness of the lens system, as he understood the killing that his optical innovation had made possible, he began to question whether his contribution had been genuinely valuable, or whether it had simply made warfare more efficient, more devastating, more lethal, more precise in its application of death. One letter dated March 1945 read, "I have received reports that the lens system I designed has been used in operations across Europe and in the Pacific theater. They say that snipers equipped with my system have achieved unprecedented accuracy, that they've changed the nature of long-range warfare. They say this is a triumph of military technology, a breakthrough in weapons development. I should feel proud, but I find myself unable to celebrate, because every one of those enhanced kill statistics represents a person who is dead. Someone's child, someone's parent, someone's lover, someone who had a future. And that person is dead because I was clever enough to solve a technical problem, because I understood light refraction, because I was proud of my work." Another letter from May 1945, just as the war in Europe was ending and as the full horror of the European theater was becoming apparent, expressed something even more troubling. "The Army is asking me to document the lens system completely, to provide all technical specifications so that the knowledge can be transmitted to other military facilities, replicated at scale, improved by subsequent researchers. They say it will be crucial for post-war military readiness, that the lens system will be valuable against future threats. But I don't want future wars to have better optics. I don't want someone to read my documentation and think, yes, I'll build on this. I'll improve on this. I want my invention to die with me. I want it to be forgotten. I'm going to destroy my research notes. I'm going to claim that the lens compound is too difficult to replicate, that the process is too intuitive, that the manufacturing requires tacit knowledge that can't be documented. I'm going to bury this knowledge, hide it, make it inaccessible." But Margaret showed me that Marcus hadn't actually destroyed the knowledge completely. What he'd done instead was something far more subtle and sophisticated. He documented the process in such a way that it appeared to be personal experimentation, fundamentally irreproducible without his particular genius, the result of accidental discovery rather than deliberate engineering and calculation. He'd written his journals in a way that seemed idiosyncratic and intuitive, filled with personal observations and artistic descriptions of optical phenomena rather than clear, systematic technical specifications. He'd made the knowledge seem inaccessible to anyone who didn't have his particular combination of skills, experience, intuition, and understanding. He was protecting the knowledge while appearing to preserve it. Margaret explained, her understanding of her husband's strategy evident in her careful articulation. He was making sure that if someone found his notes, they could read about what he'd done. They could appreciate the technical achievement, but they wouldn't be able to replicate it. He was deliberately hiding the real technical details inside descriptions of artistic inspiration and personal experimentation. It's brilliant, really. It's deception in service of what he believed was moral necessity. It's a way of taking responsibility for what he'd created while simultaneously refusing to allow that creation to propagate further. The strangest detail of all was that this careful obfuscation of knowledge had worked perfectly. After the war, when various military and civilian institutions tried to reverse engineer or replicate the Whitfield lens system based on Marcus's documentation, they couldn't do it. The published specifications didn't provide enough technical detail for reproduction. The process seemed to be something that required a particular genius, a particular combination of skills and understanding that nobody else possessed. And so the lens system, revolutionary during the war and transformative in its military applications, became impossible to reproduce after it, remaining a technological artifact that couldn't be evolved or improved because the creator had deliberately made the knowledge difficult to transmit and virtually impossible to reconstruct from published documentation. Finding the truth about Marcus Whitfield's lens system required me to reconstruct a narrative that had been deliberately obscured and hidden by its creator, that had been protected by classification and by Marcus's deliberate obfuscation of technical details. I contacted military historians specializing in weapons technology and sniper systems. I obtained declassified military records related to sniper operations during World War II, searching for references to the lens system, looking for documentation of its effectiveness, reviewing combat reports that mentioned optical innovations. I interviewed the few surviving military officers who had worked with sniper teams equipped with the Whitfield system, men now in their 90s who carried memories of what the technology had enabled. I consulted with optical engineers and physicists who could help me understand the scientific principles underlying Marcus's innovation, and what emerged was a story of revolutionary technology that had changed the nature of long-range warfare, followed by deliberate obscuration of that technology's technical specifications. One retired Army officer, Colonel Raymond Hastings, now 92 years old and still sharp-minded despite his age, had commanded sniper teams equipped with the Whitfield lens system throughout the European campaign. He agreed to meet with me in his home in North Carolina, where he'd retired after a military career spanning more than 4 decades. His home was filled with military memorabilia, photographs from various campaigns, the accumulated evidence of a life dedicated to military service. The lens system was transformative, Hastings told me, his voice carrying the weight of historical knowledge and the lingering moral ambiguity that came with understanding the implications of military technology. We had snipers who were operating in conditions where conventional optics were completely useless. In fog, in rain, in mist. Conditions where the enemy thought they were invisible, where they believed they were safe because visibility was compromised. Our snipers could still engage targets with accuracy. It gave us an advantage that we used ruthlessly. It saved American lives, but it also enabled killing on a scale and with a precision that had never been possible before. Marcus Whitfield created something revolutionary, something that changed warfare. And then he spent the rest of his life trying to make sure nobody could replicate it. I obtained Marcus's military file through official channels. It documented his recruitment, his work assignments, his security clearances, the duration of his service. But the technical specifications of his work were classified, buried deep in documents that the military was unwilling to declassify even decades after the war. The government's position was that the lens system specifications remained militarily sensitive, that even 80 years after the war, the knowledge constituted a national security concern, that revealing the details could compromise military capabilities. But I didn't need the classified files to understand what Marcus had accomplished. I had his journals. I had the letters Margaret had preserved. I had the testimony of military officers and snipers who had used his system. I had the optical theory necessary to understand how his lens compound worked, information that was available in published scientific literature once I knew what I was looking for and what optical principles to search for in the scientific record. I consulted with optical engineers and physicists at major universities. I showed them Marcus's journals and asked them to help me reconstruct his thinking. I shared the technical descriptions he'd provided and asked them to interpret what he was actually describing beneath the surface of his documentation. And I began to understand the genius of what he'd accomplished. A lens compound that used selective light refraction to enhance visibility in low-contrast, fog-obscured conditions. It was based on optical principles that existed in theoretical physics, but nobody had ever attempted to apply them in a practical lens system. It was based on understanding how glass chemistry affected light behavior, how different compounds would refract light in different ways, how to manipulate those properties to achieve specific optical effects. More importantly, I began to understand Marcus's deliberate obfuscation of the process. The journals documented experimentation, but the documentation was intentionally vague about crucial parameters. The chemical compositions were described using antiquated or artistic terminology that made them difficult to interpret precisely. The manufacturing processes were presented as intuitive adjustments rather than as precise engineering specifications. The critical parameters that would allow someone else to replicate the system were hidden within descriptions that seemed artistic or intuitive rather than technically specific. I traced Marcus's life after the war through a combination of public records, interviews with family members, and documentation in various archives. He'd returned to his jewelry business in Vermont, where he'd lived quietly for the next 42 years, building a reputation for exceptional optical instruments and precision gem cutting. He'd married Margaret shortly after returning from military service. He'd raised 3 children. He'd lived what appeared to be an ordinary, unremarkable life. But late at night, according to Margaret, he'd worked in his workshop, continuing to experiment with optical systems, though he'd never attempted to replicate the military lens compound. He'd never tried to recreate what he'd designed during wartime. He'd never attempted to improve on his wartime innovation. He said, Margaret told me, that some knowledge was dangerous, not because it was complicated, but because it was effective. He said that if the lens system was truly lost, not just classified or hidden, but genuinely impossible to replicate, then the world would be better off. He said that keeping the knowledge alive in his mind, but refusing to transmit it, was an act of moral resistance against the instrumentalization of science for military purposes. He said that scientists often believed they had no responsibility for how their work was used, but he believed differently. He believed that understanding the implications of your work and deliberately choosing to limit its transmission was a legitimate form of moral responsibility. I interviewed military historians who had attempted, in the 1950s and 1960s, to reconstruct the lens system based on Marcus's wartime documentation. Their efforts had failed completely. The documentation was insufficient for reproduction. The process was essentially irreproducible without Marcus's particular expertise and understanding. The critical parameters were either missing or obscured, and by the time military institutions realized that the technology was truly lost, that the knowledge couldn't be recovered from published documentation, Marcus had passed away, and Margaret had inherited his papers that she'd carefully preserved but deliberately kept from military researchers and military classification. He told me, Margaret said, her voice becoming even quieter, before he died, that if the military ever tried to pressure me or coerce me into providing complete documentation, I should destroy everything. He said that some knowledge should only exist for the duration of one person's life. He said that he was willing to be responsible for the power of that knowledge during the war, when it was necessary for the survival of the Allied powers. But after the war, when military necessity was no longer the driving force, he didn't want the knowledge to continue to exist. He didn't want future wars to benefit from his innovation. He didn't want his genius to be used to make future killing more efficient. Marcus Whitfield was born in 1897 in Boston, the son of a master jeweler who had emigrated from Germany and a mother whose family had operated a precision optical instrument business in England before immigrating to America at the turn of the century. His father, Johann Whitfield, born Johann Weisfeld, Americanized when the family arrived, had been trained as a master jeweler in Stuttgart, Germany, understanding the craft not as mere decoration or adornment, but as applied physics and applied optics. Gem cutting required understanding light refraction, crystal structure, the mathematical relationships that determined how light moved through transparent materials. Johann had brought that knowledge with him to America, had established a jewelry business that became known throughout New England for exceptional craftsmanship and innovative designs. Marcus's mother, Catherine, came from a family of optical instrument makers. Her father had manufactured precision lenses for telescopes and microscopes before immigrating to America. Catherine understood optics not as art, but as applied science. The mathematics of light, the chemistry of glass, the engineering principles that determined how glass could be shaped and treated to achieve specific optical properties and effects. She brought that scientific precision into her marriage and into her family. Marcus grew up immersed in both traditions, the precision craftsmanship of jewelry work and the scientific rigor of optical engineering. By the time he was 8 years old, he was helping his father cut gems, understanding instinctively how light moved through crystalline structures. By 12, he was assisting his mother in the optical workshop, learning to grind and polish lenses, understanding how minute variations in lens shape affected light refraction, learning the chemistry of glass and how different compositions behaved. His father wanted him to become a jeweler, to carry on the family tradition of exceptional craftsmanship. His mother wanted him to become an optical engineer, to pursue the scientific and technical aspects of optics that fascinated her. Marcus ultimately found a way to be both, establishing a business in the 1920s that combined jewelry craftsmanship with precision optical instrument manufacturing. He created custom spectacles for wealthy clients, designed ornamental lenses for decorative purposes, manufactured precision optical components for scientific instruments. His workshop became known for extraordinary work, optical instruments that were both beautiful and functionally superior. But more importantly, Marcus understood something that most jewelers and optical engineers didn't fully grasp. He understood the relationship between artistic sensitivity and scientific precision. He understood that making a beautiful gemstone and making a precise optical lens required the same skills: attention to detail, understanding of material properties, ability to visualize three-dimensional structures and their interactions with light. He understood that craft and science weren't separate domains but complementary ways of understanding how to work with materials to achieve intended effects. When the United States entered World War II in December 1941, Marcus was 44 years old, established in his business, married with 3 children, living a comfortable life. He was too old for direct military service, but his skills were valuable to the military-industrial complex. Within weeks of American entry into the war, he received a visit from a military recruiter, an officer in Army Ordnance who had read about Marcus's optical work in a trade journal focused on precision manufacturing. "We need someone who understands precision optics, Dow," the officer told him in Marcus's workshop. "Someone who understands how light behaves, how glass can be manipulated, how to manufacture optical systems to exact specifications. We have a project, classified of course and highly sensitive, that requires exactly your kind of expertise. Would you be willing to serve your country in this capacity?" Marcus agreed immediately. He was patriotic, though not in the unquestioning way that some men were patriotic. He believed in the Allied cause. He believed that Nazi Germany represented a threat that needed to be countered. He believed that fascism needed to be opposed. And he believed that his skills could contribute to that effort. So he closed his jewelry business, arranged for his wife to manage their finances, and reported to a classified military facility in upstate New York in January 1942. The facility was a research and development complex dedicated to improving military technology. Marcus was introduced to optical engineers, weapons specialists, military strategists, physicists working on various military applications of science. He was briefed on the project that would occupy the next 4 years of his life: improving sniper accuracy at extended distances and in adverse weather conditions. The problem, a military optical engineer explained to him in his first technical briefing, is that our snipers are limited by the capabilities of existing optical systems. In ideal conditions, with clear visibility, they're effective. But in real combat conditions, fog, rain, mist, smoke, they're nearly useless. We want to create an optical system that allows snipers to maintain accuracy in conditions where visibility is normally severely compromised. We want to give our snipers the ability to engage targets in weather that the enemy thinks will provide cover. Marcus understood the challenge immediately. It was an optical problem, but not a simple one. The issue wasn't just magnification or clarity of individual optical components. It was the fact that in fog or mist, light itself becomes diffused, scattered, lost in the moisture. The visible spectrum is disrupted by particulate matter. The fundamental physics of visibility becomes compromised. Human vision, even assisted by magnification, can't compensate for fundamentally disrupted light unless you're also manipulating how that light is processed. "What if," Marcus said during the first technical meeting, his mind already working through optical possibilities, "we didn't try to see through the fog directly? What if we manipulated the light in a way that enhanced certain wavelengths and filtered out others? What if we created a lens system that enhanced the light that does make it through the moisture, while filtering out the scattered light that creates visual noise?" The military optical engineers listened carefully. The principle Marcus was describing was based on legitimate optical theory, but nobody had ever attempted to apply it in a practical lens system. It would require glass of exceptional purity and uniformity. It would require lens grinding and polishing to tolerances that had never been achieved in military applications. It would require understanding chemical compositions and how they affected light refraction in ways that existing military technology hadn't explored. "Can you build such a system?" the military commander asked. Marcus thought carefully before responding. He understood that he was committing himself to a technical challenge that might be impossible. But he also understood the potential value of such a system, the military advantage it could provide, the lives that it might save if it worked. "I can try," he said finally. "I'll need access to raw glass materials, specialized equipment, and time. I'll need the freedom to experiment, to fail, to try different approaches, but I can try." Marcus threw himself into the project with an intensity that bordered on obsession, working in a way that consumed his thoughts day and night. He established a workshop at the military facility, equipped with optical instruments that had been specially acquired or fabricated for his work. He began experimenting with different glass compositions, testing various chemical additives that might affect light refraction in specific ways. He ground lenses with precision tolerances that had never been attempted before, creating optical components that pushed the boundaries of what was technically possible in the early 1940s. He worked with glass that was so pure it was almost transparent, so carefully manufactured that each lens could be examined for flaws that were invisible to the naked eye. The work was isolating in profound ways. The project was classified, which meant Marcus couldn't discuss his work with his wife or family, couldn't explain what he was doing, couldn't share the intellectual challenges he was engaging with. He lived on the military base, worked long hours, often 16-hour days, had limited contact with the outside world. His only communication was through letters to Margaret that were censored by military security officers before being sent. But the intellectual challenge consumed him. He was solving a problem that nobody had solved before. He was applying principles from optical physics, from his knowledge of gemstone cutting, from his understanding of light and glass, and the ways that materials could be manipulated to achieve specific effects. After 6 months of systematic experimentation, Marcus developed a preliminary lens compound that showed genuine promise. The compound was based on a specialized glass formulation that incorporated rare earth elements, materials that affected light refraction in unusual and unpredictable ways. When light passed through lenses ground from this compound, it seemed to enhance visibility in conditions where light was normally diffused and scattered, where atmospheric moisture disrupted normal vision. Marcus tested the prototype lenses with military optical equipment, comparing them to existing sniper scope systems. The results were promising but not yet sufficient for military deployment. The enhancement was real, but inconsistent. He refined the composition. He experimented with different manufacturing processes. He worked with military engineers to develop lens mounting systems that would integrate with standard military rifle scopes, that would be robust enough to survive combat conditions. By 1943, Marcus had developed a functional lens system that could be mounted on sniper rifles. The system worked by using selective light filtering to enhance visibility in fog and mist. Snipers testing the system reported dramatically improved accuracy in adverse weather conditions. What had previously been impossible, precision shooting in fog, became possible. Targets that should have been invisible became visible. Accuracy improved by percentages that seemed almost miraculous. The military was ecstatic with the results. Here was a technological advantage that could influence combat operations, that could save American lives, that could change the nature of sniper warfare in fundamental ways. They wanted Marcus to document the system completely, to provide technical specifications that could be transmitted to other military facilities, to ensure that every sniper unit could be equipped with the Whitfield lens system, to standardize the technology across the military. But as Marcus worked on the documentation, as he received reports about how the lens system was being used in combat operations, as he began to understand the killing that his optical innovation had enabled, as he received statistics about the effectiveness of the system and the number of targets engaged, his enthusiasm began to erode. He started experiencing what would now be recognized as moral distress, an internal conflict between pride in his technical achievement and horror at what that achievement had made possible. He documented this struggle in the letters he wrote to his wife, but never sent. In one letter from late 1943, he wrote, "I have created something that works better than I imagined it would. The lens system exceeds all expectations. It performs beyond specifications. Military officers have shown me reports of combat operations where snipers equipped with my system have engaged targets at distances and in conditions that were previously impossible. They speak with pride about the effectiveness of the system. They show me statistics, number of targets engaged, accuracy percentages, Kill ratios. They're proud of the technology. They congratulate me on the breakthrough, but I find myself unable to feel that pride. Because the numbers they're showing me aren't statistics. They're not abstract data points, they're people who are dead. Real people. People who had families. Another letter from early 1944 expressed something even more troubling and morally complex. I have been asked to document the lens system for military archives, to ensure that the knowledge isn't lost, that future military scientists can build on what I've accomplished, to improve on the system, and I find myself unable to do it. Not because the documentation is technically difficult, it isn't, but because I don't want future wars to have better optics. I don't want my contribution to outlive me. I don't want my knowledge to become the foundation for more sophisticated killing technology. So I'm going to create documentation that preserves the appearance of transparency while actually obscuring the true technical specifications. I'm going to make my work seem inaccessible, idiosyncratic, irreproducible. I'm going to hide my knowledge in plain sight. This is exactly what Marcus did, with deliberate intention and careful planning. He documented his work in his official military journals, providing detailed descriptions of his experimentation and his ultimate success. But the documentation was presented in a way that made the process seem almost accidental, a result of intuitive experimentation, rather than deliberate engineering and calculation. Chemical compositions were described using vague terminology and artistic language. Manufacturing processes were presented as intuitive adjustments rather than as precise specifications. The critical parameters that would allow someone else to replicate the system were buried in descriptions that seemed poetic or artistic, rather than technically specific. It was a form of deception that served what Marcus believed was a moral purpose. He was protecting the knowledge from being replicated while appearing to preserve it for future generations. He was ensuring that his contribution would have the military value that was necessary during wartime, but wouldn't become the foundation for more sophisticated killing technology in future conflicts. He was taking responsibility for limiting knowledge as a form of moral action. By 1945, as the war in Europe was ending and the war in the Pacific continued with devastating intensity, Marcus began working on the final documentation. He knew that his time on the military project was ending, that he would be returning to civilian life soon, and he was determined that when he left the facility, when he returned to his jewelry business in Vermont, the technical knowledge of how to replicate the lens system would leave with him. He created detailed journals that described his experimentation and results in poetic language. He provided military officers with enough information to understand what he'd accomplished and to appreciate the technical achievement. But he deliberately withheld the crucial parameters that would allow military scientists and optical engineers to actually replicate the lens system after the war. He obscured the chemical formulas. He made the manufacturing process seem intuitive rather than systematic. He hid the real knowledge inside artistic descriptions and personal observations. When military officials pressed him for complete technical specifications, demanding that he provide reproducible documentation, Marcus claimed that the lens compound required particular glass materials that had specific properties that were difficult to articulate precisely, that the manufacturing process involved adjustments that required hands-on experience to perfect, that the complete process was partially based on tacit knowledge and intuition that couldn't be fully documented in written form. It was technically true, but it was also a deliberate obstruction of knowledge that Marcus believed should not be transmitted further into the world. Marcus Whitfield died in 1987, at the age of 90, in his home in Vermont, surrounded by the optical equipment and tools that had defined his life. He had lived 42 years after the war, running his jewelry and optical instrument business, living quietly, raising his family, maintaining absolute silence about his wartime work. He had never replicated the lens system. He had never attempted to develop an improved version. He had deliberately chosen to let the knowledge remain with him, to die with him, to not be transmitted to future generations of scientists or military researchers. After his death, Margaret discovered the letters he'd written but never sent. 45 years of correspondence documenting his wartime experience, his moral struggles, his decision to deliberately obscure the technical knowledge he'd developed. She read them carefully, understanding for the first time the internal conflict her husband had carried throughout their marriage, the weight he'd been carrying all those years. The military had tried after the war to understand the lens system more completely. Officers had visited Marcus's home multiple times, requesting that he provide more detailed technical documentation, attempting to convince him that post-war military readiness required preserving the knowledge. Military optical engineers had attempted to reverse engineer the system based on his published specifications. Manufacturers had tried to replicate the glass compound based on the descriptions in his journals. None of their attempts had succeeded. The knowledge seemed to be lost, irreproducible, inaccessible, something that had existed for a specific historical moment and then disappeared when its creator chose not to transmit it. By the time I began investigating Marcus Whitfield's story, military interest in the lens system had faded into historical curiosity. The technical requirements for replicating it had been overtaken by subsequent optical innovations. The specific glass compounds Marcus had developed were no longer militarily significant because newer optical technologies, infrared systems, thermal imaging, digital enhancement had surpassed them. The Whitfield lens system had become a historical curiosity, a remarkable wartime innovation that had proven impossible to replicate or improve, a technological dead end because its creator had deliberately ensured that the knowledge couldn't be transmitted. I contacted military historians, optical engineers, and military officials. I obtained declassified documents related to the project. I reviewed Marcus's military file, which documented his recruitment, his work assignments, and his final reports. But the military classification system had protected the technical specifications of his work, ensuring that even 80 years later, the complete knowledge of how the lens system functioned remained classified, locked away in secure facilities, inaccessible to researchers. But I didn't need the classified information to tell Marcus's story. I had his journals. I had his letters. I had the testimony of military officers and optical engineers who had worked with him. I had the understanding that this man had made a deliberate ethical choice to limit the transmission of knowledge because he believed that some technologies shouldn't be made freely available. Margaret was initially hesitant about sharing Marcus's personal papers with me. She worried about military repercussions. She was concerned about classified information. She was protective of her husband's privacy and his intentions. But she also understood that her husband had chosen to preserve the letters, that he'd deliberately kept them from military classification, that he'd wanted the story of his moral struggle to be known by future generations. He told me, Margaret explained, her voice becoming quieter, near the end of his life, that someday someone might want to know why he'd kept the knowledge secret. He said that he didn't regret his wartime contribution. He understood that military necessity had required it. But he did regret the implications of that contribution, and he didn't want future wars to benefit from the technology he'd developed. He said that destroying knowledge was a form of moral responsibility that wasn't often acknowledged or understood. He said that most people believed that all knowledge should be preserved, transmitted, improved, but he believed differently. He believed that some knowledge should only exist for the duration of one person's life. He believed that accepting responsibility for limiting what you'd created was sometimes the most important contribution you could make. I published the story of Marcus Whitfield in a journal of military history and ethics. I presented the research at academic conferences on technology, morality, and warfare. I documented the unusual ethical stance that Marcus had taken, the decision to deliberately obscure technical knowledge, to limit its transmission, to accept responsibility for limiting human understanding as a form of moral restraint against the instrumentalization of science for warfare. The military initially resisted the publication, citing classification concerns and national security interests. But ultimately, they declined to force suppression of the story. The lens system was obsolete. The technical specifications, while officially classified, had been overtaken by subsequent developments, and the military itself recognized that Marcus's deliberate limitation of knowledge was, in fact, a decision that had served military and human interests by preventing the development of increasingly sophisticated killing technology based on his original innovation. The National Archives created a small exhibit, Marcus Whitfield, Optical Innovation and Moral Restraint. The exhibit displayed photographs from Marcus's military file, samples of his optical equipment, reproductions of his journals, with classified information redacted, detailed explanations of the ethical stance he'd taken regarding the transmission of his knowledge. The exhibit challenged visitors to consider difficult questions about the relationship between scientific innovation and moral responsibility, between technical achievement and ethical restraint. Margaret lived to see the exhibit open, passing away at 94 years old, satisfied that her husband's story had finally been told, that his moral struggle had been documented and preserved for future generations to understand and to learn from. The photograph of Marcus Whitfield from August 1942 now hangs in the National Archives exhibit on the third floor of the main building in Washington, D.C., displayed alongside reproductions of his journals and letters, accompanied by contextual information explaining his work and his moral struggle. It shows a man who appears peaceful despite working with military technology and optical systems that would enhance killing and warfare. His expression is concentrated, focused, professional. His hands are positioned carefully over precision instruments. He looks like a craftsman engaged in work that requires attention and care, someone who takes pride in precision, someone who believes he's contributing to something important and meaningful. The photograph captures him at work, engaged in the technical challenges of creating something revolutionary. But the photograph takes on entirely different meaning when understood in its full context, when the history behind the image is understood, when the moral journey that followed is known. It's not just a photograph of a craftsman at work. It's a photograph of someone who was about to make a deliberate ethical choice, to develop technology that would save military lives, but then to deliberately obscure that technology to prevent its replication and improvement in future conflicts. The photograph shows what was visible: a skilled optical craftsman engaged in wartime military research, creating equipment that would change the nature of sniper warfare, enabling killing with unprecedented precision and in weather conditions where it had previously been impossible. The photograph also shows what wasn't captured in the image: Marcus's growing moral distress, his internal conflict between pride in his technical achievement and horror at what that achievement had made possible, his decision to deliberately obscure his knowledge, his choice to accept responsibility for limiting human understanding as a form of moral restraint against future warfare. Standing before the photograph in the National Archives exhibit, visitors read the contextual information and understand that this man, this peaceful-looking craftsman, had made an unusual ethical choice. He'd developed a revolutionary technology during wartime when military necessity seemed to override moral concerns. But then he'd spent 42 years deliberately limiting the transmission of that knowledge, refusing to allow his work to become the foundation for more sophisticated killing technology in future conflicts. Margaret's preservation of Marcus's personal papers made this understanding possible. She kept the letters safe through decades of potential military pressure. She protected them from military classification. She understood that her husband's moral struggle was as important as his technical achievement, and that the story of that struggle deserved to be preserved and told for future generations. The photograph remains on display in the National Archives. The letters are preserved in acid-free folders in the archive's permanent collection. The story is documented and available for future generations to understand. And Marcus Whitfield, the quiet jeweler who created optical systems that changed warfare, and who then deliberately limited the transmission of that knowledge, becomes a figure who challenges simple narratives about technological progress and innovation. He demonstrates that genius isn't just about creating something new. Sometimes genius is about recognizing when knowledge should not be transmitted further, when innovation needs to be limited, when moral responsibility means deliberately restricting what you've learned so that future wars can't benefit from increasingly sophisticated technology. The photograph captures him at a moment before this moral awakening was complete, before he fully understood what his invention would enable. But the photograph, combined with his letters and journals, tells a more complete story of a craftsman who created something revolutionary, who then spent the rest of his life making sure that his creation wouldn't become the foundation for future killing technology. That is a different kind of heroism than is usually acknowledged. That is the heroism of restraint, of moral limitation, of deliberately choosing not to transmit knowledge that might be used for purposes you believe are morally wrong. That is the heroism of accepting responsibility for the power of what you've created by deliberately limiting its propagation. Marcus Whitfield's photograph is a testament to that unusual form of heroism, and the story it tells, finally revealed after 80 years of silence, is one that deserves to be remembered and understood by future generations of scientists, engineers, and people who grapple with the ethical implications of their work. The photograph shows a man who was brilliant, dedicated, and ultimately deeply moral. A man who understood that sometimes the most important contribution you can make is to limit what you've created so that it can't be used to make future killing more efficient.